Sorry we don't have the translation, but I know your English is perfect, so we go ahead anyway. Thank you very much, everybody. I want to introduce you to Adam Howard. He earned a PhD in history from the University of Florida. He spent 22 years at the U.S. Department of State, working in the office of the as a historian. During his final 7 years, he served as department's chief historian. Last year, he left that position to become executive director of the International Churchill Society in Washington at the George Washington University. He also teaches history and international affairs at George Washington University. Adam, the floor is yours. I have many questions, but...
Well, first, thank you all for coming here. I know there's a lot of distractions that you could be doing, so I appreciate you taking the time to hear more about Winston Churchill. And secondly, thank you for concentrating in English, because I know this now means you have to focus a different part of your muscles in your brain. But unfortunately, the most I can say is bon dia.
Adam, I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit closer to the mic.
Okay.
It's almost a rock and roll session. So, please tell us about the ICS and the International Churchill Society, and actually the importance of keeping Churchill's legacy alive. Why are we doing all that?
So the International Churchill Society started all the way back in 1968. It actually originates in the United States. Many people think it's from Britain, but it actually starts in the United States, which I think speaks to the fact that Winston Churchill's legacy is so international. And that's one of the reasons why I've been both impressed, but I perhaps shouldn't be surprised that here in Brazil, Winston Churchill is so popular with so many people. The society itself has a physical location in Washington, D.C. It's in a partnership with George Washington University, and that is the headquarters for the International Churchill Society. However, there are over 40 chapters, both in the United States but around the world, and obviously here in Brazil is one of those. We have chapters now in Italy, France, Iceland, Norway. We're about to get one in Austria. So we hope to keep growing as more and more people become aware of what the society does, which is to preserve the legacy of Winston Churchill, but also to make him relevant for young people in particular, so they understand why he's important and what impact that he had over the whole course of his 90 years of life.
And Churchill served the world, saved the world in World War II with his speeches, and you said something about his alliances. So I would like to go back to this, why are alliances important?
Yeah. So one of the things that makes Churchill obviously so popular is what happened in 1940. Yes, he predicted the threat of Nazi Germany during the 1930s, but when he finally came to power in May 1940, what makes him so significant to a lot of people is how he turned a weak hand into a strong hand. And the only way he could do that is through alliances. And that's something that I always like to talk to people about when you think about the most important elements of leadership, whether it's political, business, finance, it doesn't matter. You have to cultivate relationships. People have to have faith that you are there to work with them. And some people do that on a transactional basis. And sometimes you need to do those things. For example, Churchill said that he would give a good reference to the devil if Hitler invaded hell. Even though Churchill hated communism and hated the Soviet Union, he was pragmatic. And that's part of it, that's transactional. But when it came to others like the United States, he recognized that there is a cultural connection. He recognized that there was a political connection based on democracy, based on freedom, based on free trade. And so these are the kinds of things he recognized would be helpful, but also something he needed to cultivate in order to be successful, because many people forget that in 1940, the United States was an isolationist country. There were people who were sympathetic to the British cause, like Franklin Roosevelt, who was president at the time. But even President Roosevelt thought the war would be a long war, so he didn't think there was a necessity right away. Most people assumed the British and the French, who were pretty evenly matched on paper with the Germans before May 1940, would have another long war like World War I. But of course, within 6 weeks, the collapse of France, Great Britain on the ropes, that's when those in the United States, like Franklin Roosevelt, realized this was a very challenging situation for the United States because Germany could eventually come across the ocean. But many people in the United States questioned whether Britain was going to stay in it to win it. If the United States supplies aid to Great Britain in the summer of 1940, will it be simply a waste of resources because the British decide to make a deal the way the French did in June of 1940? And so Churchill had to prove to the world that they were willing to fight and be resilient. Now, many people know the speeches, all the famous speeches, "We shall fight in the streets, we will fight in the landing grounds," all these kinds of remarkable oratory statements that inspired people. But he did other things that were also strategic communication that many people don't think as much about. For example, he was in a position where he had to worry that the French fleet could be captured by the Germans. And so in summer of 1940, July of 1940, just a few weeks after France had been the ally of Great Britain, he made the decision that he needed to force the French to either give their ships up to the British and fight with them, or destroy their own ships so that the Germans couldn't have them, or the British would destroy them. And in the end, the French did not give up their ships, nor did they destroy their own ships. So Churchill had to make the difficult decision to do that. But part of his reasoning was to let the rest of the world know, especially the United States, that he was in this to win this. And that therefore they could trust that if they supplied the British with aid, it would go for the right cause and not be wasted in some sort of agreement with the Germans where all that material was turned over to the Germans. So I think, to your original question, that is one of the most pivotal legacies that the International Churchill Society wants everyone to understand about Churchill. There's more, which we'll get to, but that's probably the most significant thing that a lot of people don't know about, or they know parts of it, but they don't know the whole story. And so that's a big part of the work we do through education, whether it's podcasts, whether it's providing teachers with educational resources, holding conferences where we can speak to audiences like this. That's what we do.
Great. And FDR wanted some reassurance, and then he sent Hopkins and Harriman to Great Britain to see if Churchill was someone he could trust. Please let's talk about a little this.
So Franklin Roosevelt did what many American presidents have done and still do. They don't trust their own institutions like the State Department, so a lot of times they'll choose special envoys. These are usually personal friends for many years who they have a deep trust in. And Franklin Roosevelt had gone to private schools. The school was called the Groton School. He made friends there like Averell Harriman. And these were people he put his faith in to figure out, was Winston Churchill going to be someone dependable? Was he going to be somebody who, again, if they invest the resources, would be using them? Or was he simply going to be either himself willing to give in, or was he someone who didn't know how to cultivate relationships from within his own government? Because if anybody in his own government decided to walk away, that was the end of Churchill as prime minister. So he had to keep the faith within his own circle. And President Roosevelt wanted to make sure he would stay in power and fight to the end. And Churchill did. And that's the legacy that's so impressive. And that's the number one reason why so many people look to Churchill now, regardless of any criticisms of mistakes he made before that.
Alan Packard said once, is in my book, he said, the more you know about, or the more you read about Churchill, the more there is to be understood and the more there is to be studied. So, as an historian, how is Churchill recognized in the academic world? Do you believe there has been changes in the last years in how important he was? Let's say, for example, on the communication schools, like here in Puki, Churchill he wrote 12 million words. He wrote the sum of Shakespeare with Dickens. He wrote 42 titles with 72 volumes, and he's not even studied in the communication schools. What is going on? So why not?
Well, I can't speak for communication schools in the United States since I teach history, so I'm in the history department. But I can say And again, at least for the United States, I can say he's still taught. I ask my students all the time, did you learn about Churchill when you were in secondary education? And an overwhelming majority say yes. Now, I think another part of your question is how is he being taught? And there are criticisms. I think some of them are legitimate criticisms, which are fine. That's part of debate. That's part of a free society. There are other criticisms, though, that I would argue are not grounded in fact, and that's where it becomes a challenge. It's coming from two sides, in the United States at least. There is an argument from the left side, left political side in the United States, that Churchill's commitment to British imperialism and the racist ideas that he held make him unworthy of studying for all the other things. Now, I don't have any problem with open debate about what he said, and he said things that I think a lot of us would have problems with now when it came to India, for example, and other places. But the idea that you simplify and reduce a person to only one element of their record is very problematic. From the other side now, especially in the last couple of years, we're hearing from the right side of the American political spectrum, from those who argue that Churchill was a warmonger, meaning he had a chance to make a deal with Hitler in the summer of 1940, which members of his cabinet were urging, like Lord Halifax, and that he chose war, and that therefore he's responsible for many more deaths than there needed to be. They also argue that he was suppressing civil liberties because he was putting in jail fascists in England who supported Nazi Germany. So that's coming from the right side in the United States. And then, as I mentioned, from the left side is the criticism from his imperialist ideas, his ideas about racial hierarchy. So those are challenging, but I would still argue it's a good news story in the United States overall. That for the most part, as I've said many times, and I know some of you heard me say this at other venues, Churchill, I think, is more popular in the United States than he is in Great Britain.
Okay. And in your view, what was Churchill's forte? What was his strongest capacities or skills?
Sure. So one of them I think we've touched on, which is communication. There's very few people who had those kinds of skills when it came to oratory. He didn't use big words. He didn't try to sound fancy when it came to his audience. He was very careful to be very to the point, clear, simple language so that everybody in Great Britain, but beyond Great Britain, could understand it. And I think that's why he resonates as a communicator to this day. Because even for those of you where English isn't your first language, you can read a Churchill speech and grasp it quickly and understand what he's trying to convey. So that part's remarkable. And his communication wasn't limited just to speeches. As was already mentioned, Ricardo, you mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned the Nobel Prize, but you certainly mentioned all
Not
of
yet.
the literature. Okay. So all the literature that Ricardo referenced ultimately led in 1953 to Churchill winning a Nobel Prize in literature. But what's significant for strategic communication is a lot of what he wrote was intended to influence the audiences in different countries, notably the United States. For example, he wrote the English-speaking peoples, history of the English-speaking peoples, which specifically looks at all of the dominions of Great Britain, like Canada, Australia, but also the history of the United States. He was an interested person. He was an historian. He was curious, which is important. But he also wanted to make sure that those audiences saw the connecting points culturally, politically, that they shared a similar theme when it came to their existence. So when he looked, for example, at American history and wrote about the American Revolution, he was very clear to argue that this was not a break between Britain and the United States. It was a family quarrel, and it was a family quarrel over the same important themes. And in fact, he said the Declaration of Independence is one of the three most important documents of the people who celebrate freedom and liberty. He didn't look at it as a different document of another country, but rather part of this important commitment to freedom, to democracy. And so he was very careful when he wrote or gave speeches to figure out who his audience was and make sure that they understood that he wanted to bring them in to his circle. And he did it with other countries too, but of course, one of the biggest legacies he has is the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. He recognized both before World War II, but especially after World War II, that it was critical for Britain to stay as close as possible to the United States as the United States evolved into a superpower. And he recognized that the United States represented the values of Great Britain, and therefore was pivotal that every leader after him, as he said, you must stay close to the United States.
Though he had strong criticism to democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government besides all others. So
Well,
why was this critic on democracy?
so Ricardo is getting at a quote which actually says democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. Recognizing that democracy is messy, it's complicated, it's not efficient, but the alternative, which is centralized government, authoritarianism, may be more efficient. And in the 1930s, there were many people who felt that way. But in the end, you lose the innovation, you lose the creativity that comes from open discussion, open debate. And one of the most remarkable legacies, going back to the communication theme, back in 1911, he formed what's known as the Other Club. And what I thought was so remarkable is he was a member of the Liberal Party at that time in Great Britain, and one of his close friends, F.H. Smith, who was a member of the Conservative Party, they wanted to form a club where they could have debates, very strong debates on all kinds of political issues, but do it in an environment where they could be friendly, respectful, they could have jokes, and they could enjoy themselves. And that's something that, as part of his mindset, he wanted to collect information, he wanted to learn, he wanted to debate, but he also didn't want to create an opposition of enemies when actually they were all on the same side when it came to democracy, when it came to trade. There might be disagreements on some levels of how far it should go when it came to questions of free trade, or how far it should go when it came to issues of freedom and democracy. But they were all in the same place where he wanted to make sure that they communicated that clearly. So I think that's an incredible legacy that he left that a lot of people don't know about. If you ever get to London, I encourage you to visit the Savoy Hotel. That's where he held those dinners, and he went to them until the very end of his life in the 1960s.
And there is this story with Lord Beaverbrook, his longtime friend from school, and they discussed a lot. They had strong discussions. And Lord Beaverbrook asked to resignation many times, and Churchill never let him out. And then Lord Eden said, "You're always fighting. Why don't you, just get rid of him?" He said, "I have to have someone that thinks completely different from me, so I can have a better decision." So, but nowadays, what happens when we have people that argue with us? We cancel them. We take them out of our Instagram. We eliminate them. So, a good lesson, a strong lesson.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's one of the most, if you ever take leadership classes, they always talk about the importance of you must have people who take opposing positions. In fact, having worked at the State Department, after 9/11, it was required to have what we call red team, meaning you put people in the room who challenge your assumptions. Even if they don't necessarily believe those assumptions, they're always questioning you so you don't fall into traps of group think, so that you're not all thinking the same way and not seeing certain things. And Churchill, as you point out, that was very important to him. And it was a lesson he learned the hard way, because initially he didn't listen as much when he was younger to those in his own government during World War I, for example, and that's part of the reason why the Gallipoli campaign was a disaster, and partly why he, of course, almost ruined his career from that. But he learned. And so when World War II came, he was much more open to listening to his generals, much more opening to getting people who disagreed with him in the room. And whenever I talk to CEOs or other people who like Churchill, I always ask, what's the thing that resonates for you in business as opposed to geopolitics? And yes, they refer to the oratory and the great speeches, but they note that he was willing to have critics in the room with him. And that's a very important skill set, because it takes a humble ego. And most people don't think Churchill was very humble, but in this case he was.
There is a story that Churchill argued a lot with his generals, and as he was also military, he wanted, to influence. But when the decision was built, he led all responsibility and he led all the campaign to their generals. He never went over their heads. Hitler, by the other hand, let everybody speak, and then at the end he said, "Okay, now you're going to do as I say." And Stalin, because he killed 1 million people and most of his generals in 1937, he had no generals to talk to. So he had to let them leave. And then when Russia starts to win, he went back and said, "Oh, that's what I'm doing." So this
And this wasn't simple. For example, with D-Day, Churchill was very, very worried about D-Day becoming another Gallipoli. And so he had to hold himself back. He actually wanted to go in with the soldiers.
That's a funny story.
He wanted to go in on D-Day, June 6, 1944, with the soldiers to observe because he felt he needed to be there. Now, I think that speaks also to one of the remarkable aspects of Churchill, that he was a man of action, always wanted to be part of what was happening, even if it meant the incredible travel he did to meet with Stalin or to meet with Roosevelt. He would fly in these planes, which weren't pressurized back then. And he was 65 when he was initially prime minister and then aged to 70 during the war. But again, with D-Day, despite the fact that he desperately wanted to go, ultimately the king told him, you cannot go. And so he backed off. But he worried. So I don't want you to think he just became a very humble man at 65. He struggled with it, but he recognized that he needed to listen to those who either had more experience or better knowledge about certain issues.
And the book of Alan Packwood, Letter for Ages, have these letters where the king and him exchange. And at the end, he said, okay, I'm not going, but letting the king know that he was not pleased with that.
And he did go about a week later. So he did get there about a week and a half later.
Well, after more than 1,000 books on Churchill, films, documentaries on Churchill, is there still something to learn from him? Is there something different? Or are there aspects that are less known about him?
Yes. A big theme that I think a lot of people aren't aware of is his innovation. And what I mean by that is how he approached many different aspects of government and technology. Back in 1911, for example, he convinced the British government to switch from coal to oil so that the Navy could reach greater distances at higher speed more efficiently. But then, just 3 years later when the World War I was started, he came up with the first public-private partnership. He convinced the British government to purchase a majority of what was then Anglo-Persian Oil Company, now British Petroleum. And everybody won because the government got the security it needed to ensure a steady supply of oil without interruption for the war effort. British Petroleum ensured a steady supply of investment and also a certain amount of protection, knowing that it was going to be a customer was not going to go disappear on them. And so this was the first of public-private partnerships, which have been essential for the success of both Britain and the United States when it comes to capitalism. And then he also was innovative in technology. He's arguably deserves tremendous credit for the use of the tank in World War I. He actually was the one who led the committee that ultimately adopted tanks in World War I. He also was the one who got the British to adopt airplanes for fighting during World War I. And then even later, in one of the best stories I don't think anybody knows, and I don't know why there isn't a movie about this, he authorized a mission of scientists from Great Britain who had already started developing the early stages for atomic weapons for radar, and I'm talking about radar that you could put in an airplane. And then there were other developments too that he authorized them to go from Great Britain in the summer of 1940 to the United States, knowing the United States was isolationist, knowing the United States could take this technology if it was shared with them and bring it to the Germans potentially. But he took the risk because he thought it was so important to have the industrial capacity of the United States and the American scientists helping them. And from that initial mission that he authorized in summer of 1940, we get what's called the cavity magnetron, which was put into airplanes and onto ships so that they could identify enemy fighters in the clouds, use anti-aircraft guns that could shoot through the clouds, find submarines. They always say the atomic bomb won World War II, but many say that, atomic bomb ended World War II, but it was radar that won World War II. And of course, the atomic weapons research they were doing led to the Manhattan Project. So this is another example, I find, of this innovative mind where Churchill recognized all of what was important in the latest scientific research, recognized that to win the war, he had to take huge risks. And this was one of them, but it paid off.
Well, he had always by his side during World War II, forgot his first name, Professor Lindemann. Yeah. There was a scientist that was, the closest advisor to him, I think, in a certain way.
So Lindemann and Henry Tizard, did not get along. So Tizard had to work through the bureaucracy to get to Churchill, but ultimately, once Churchill heard about this, he recognized this had to be done. But Lindemann had been the one advising him on science for years.
Churchill had a stamp that said, action this day.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about this.
So Churchill, one of, I think, his greatest legacies is the energy. Actually, Ricardo kind of reminds me of this energy because it never ends. Churchill would go travel, as I mentioned before, at 65, 66, 67. He never ran out of energy for ideas and what he thought was important. And so during World War II, he had memos that he gave to his staff, and he put on the top, action this day, because he never wanted people to waste any time. That fighting the war was, frankly, fighting for civilization. And so therefore, you could not waste time. You must always be engaged. But this, to me, goes beyond this idea of action this day, goes beyond World War II. This is something that was important to him his whole life. And that energy and that commitment to whatever cause he was involved in, I think is something that's very attractive to a lot of people, and it's contagious. And I think that's why he's obviously got the legacy he has now.
So, Adam, thank you very much. And how could we get involved with the Churchill Society?
I'm glad you asked that, Ricardo.
Yeah, well.
So for anybody interested in learning more about what we do or the resources we can provide, especially if you're involved in education or you just want to educate people in your family or yourself, winstonchurchill.org or winstonchurchill.org. It can't get simpler than that. That's the website to go to. We also have a podcast that you can find on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. You can look under International Churchill Society and it'll come up for you right there. So those are the easy ways, but we have a membership. We have a journal we publish every quarter called Finest Hour, from the speech that Churchill gave where he referred to the finest hour. So these are the easy ways to get involved. And if you get to the States in October this year in Philadelphia, we have a big conference with many great speakers who will be there. So I encourage any of you who are in a position to come to the United States in October. But at the very least, please, winstonchurchill.org. You will see opportunities for membership, but you will also have plenty of access to all kinds of resources that you may find of interest.
Adam, thank you very much. And keep buggering on, right?
Yes, keep buggering on.
Keep buggering on.
KBO, it was called. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for putting up through English the entire time.